Okay, so we are going to be looking at the poem London. Now, the themes that I've brought up in London are as follows. So we've got the theme of oppression, poverty, politics, urbanization/industrialization, disillusionment, and misery. And I want to add just underneath this list of themes that one other kind of sneakier theme, maybe a bit more subdued than the rest, is capitalism. This is a more, I guess, sophisticated theme, and it definitely links in with the idea of urbanization and industrialization. This idea that post kind of industrial revolution, which was when companies were taking over and there was more concern with profits and there was more concerns with machinery. Machines were kind of coming into play here. The Industrial Revolution actually carried on for a long time, way into the 1800s, but this was kind of when it was being responded to. It had just kind of begun. There was this kind of idea of urbanization. More people were moving into the city in order to work with these machines, work in factories, work in these kind of industrial focused jobs and roles. And the root of capitalism is that there is kind of one man in control. So there's this hierarchy of people where the man in control gets more money. There's this idea of leadership and then people underneath. And I think this idea definitely leaches into London. And London is essentially about the city of London, but it's also about the implications of having capitalism enter this city, right? As a consequence of the Industrial Revolution, or as a consequence of more urbanization, where more people were moving away from the countrysides into the city where there would be more jobs. So this kind of concentrated area where jobs were focused in was London. And this obviously increased the population of the city at the time. And so I think these two themes really match up when we look at the consequences of urbanization and capitalism. This consequence of people having to move at the time away from farms, away from manual labor, into the city of London, especially, where, you know, people became more concentrated. There was more competition for jobs, there was more competition for money, and money wasn't distributed properly. The one man at the top had all the money and he would control all the people underneath him. And this still happens today. We still live in capitalist societies, you know, where one man is at the top of it all, and then there's people who work for that one man, and this gap between the rich and the poor got a lot bigger, got a lot more increased, which I think definitely links to disillusionment and misery, especially. This idea that population increased due to capitalism, which essentially ended up causing an increase in concentration. It ended up causing an increase in the number of people who were concentrated in London. And this caused a gap between the rich and the poor. It caused a bigger gap between the rich and the poor, and more poor people. Obviously, when you have more people moving into a city to compete for the same amount of jobs, you have more people out of work, you have more people concentrated in this small environment. You essentially have this influx or this increase of poor people, right? So tons of people who are out of work, who had to look for work as thieves, as prostitutes, as robbers, as grave diggers, and they would have children, and those children would end up in that cycle of poverty. So I'm going to add that to this cycle of poverty and disillusionment, this idea that people went into London looking for jobs because of capitalism, because their jobs were taken away, because their jobs were replaced by machines because of industrialization. And so they moved, and then they couldn't get jobs, or they would get very low paid jobs which wouldn't, you know, support them enough, and so they would end up kind of disillusioned. So Blake was actually an advocate of the French Revolution, which happened a few years prior, and he actually would walk around London with a red hat to symbolise his loyalties towards the French Revolution. And of course, the French Revolution, what is it? It was essentially poor people overthrowing the aristocrats in France. So it was essentially a revolution of the poor against the rich. there was this idea of perhaps a brimming revolution in England, and especially in London, after it happened in France. I think people in England, and especially London, were expecting a similar kind of effect that happened in France, that people who were poor would end up eventually revolting. Now, it never happened, but I definitely think there was some kind of brimming ideas of a British revolution. Blake, in a sense, is warning the readers of the poem that perhaps, there is a chance of a British revolution, of the British revolting and creating havoc just as the French did. This kind of warning as well that actually the roots of the French Revolution were down to the gross, awful unfairness of it all, that so many poor people were so poor and the rich were so rich, and this disparity between the rich and the poor, that there was, so much difference and so many poor people, such a huge vast amount of poor people and so little rich people. So this wealth that was redistributed wasn't distributed fairly, that actually money was just so scarce in so many parts of London. Yeah, there's definitely a sense of warning that perhaps he was kind of telling people, especially rich people, if something doesn't change, then something's going to happen. And we will look at the language in more detail, but definitely the language in the poem reflects this idea. We've got language such as cry, soldiers. We've got this reference to soldiers, runs in blood down palace walls. The peasants in France stormed the palace walls and actually guillotined a lot of royalty. Reference to the French Revolution, and of course a warning as well that the British could also be capable of revolting. We've got stuff like mind-forged manacles, and I've mentioned cry and ban and curse and tear, real deep-rooted anger, which stems from the unfairness of poverty. I definitely think, I've got these two, oppression and politics, and how these two ideas definitely go hand in hand. Of course, all themes go hand in hand, guys. Like, you can link one theme to the next, but definitely oppression and politics, this idea of political unfairness. The government has taken away jobs for people in the countryside, which results in the people in the countryside moving to London, and then the government hasn't given them any jobs. So there's just kind of this political unrest, which I think is brewing in this poem. This idea of being chartered. It's a very political word. We'll look into it in more detail because it's actually a very interesting adjective. But first and foremost, what chartered means is something that is owned by the government. So this idea of wandering through each chartered street, this idea that the street itself is not free for the public, it's actually owned by the government, and that the public, these poor people who are walking on that street, they're almost owned by the government as well, and they're almost held hostage by this cruel government who won't give them any money, who take away their freedom in a sense. So there's definitely this idea of removal. And of course, this idea of political control and political unrest in this adjective mind forged, this idea of people's minds, being controlled, being forged by the government. And again, I think this idea of government and an aristocracy and rich people, they're all kind of hand in hand. They all work together to give each other more power and remove power from the public, from, the poor people, or even the middle class people in the public who are just having their money taken away from them. So this idea of oppression feeds into this concept of politics, and it all, again, like I said, goes hand in hand. Who is being oppressed? Well, it's, these poor people, it's these harlots, these prostitutes, these infants, these poor children, even these soldiers who assist in war, who end up coming back to Britain and end up having their rights taken away from them. And a lot of soldiers of the time came back after fighting for the country and actually were rendered homeless. Chimney sweepers as well, this idea of children being put into this capitalist machine, having to work, having to earn, and a lot of these children were orphans. And here we've got, in the cry of every man, this adjective every really, I think, solidifies the idea of who exactly is oppressed. Well, it's everyone who's oppressed. It's pretty much a huge part of the population, really emphasised by this adjective every, that so many people were actually oppressed. There's so many poor people, and there's hardly any rich people, and there's no real idea of sharing the wealth, of giving the wealth away. It's this vein of selfishness which was occurring at the time, which caused so many poor people to suffer. So yeah, I think that really goes over the kind of base of the poem, and looking from the outside, looking at the themes which really reflect the poem, we can see that this poem is going to be pretty, I guess, upsetting and miserable and kind of sad. So just some background stuff about William Blake. He was actually known by William Michael Rossetti as a glorious luminary. And so I've added that quote by Rossetti in quotes because a luminary is someone who influences others. And this is such an interesting quote, I think, because actually in his time, William Blake wasn't hugely popular. He was noticed, but he wasn't well known. He wasn't super popular in his time. So I think it's really interesting and quite cool quote to call him a luminary. And this idea of Blake as someone who influences and changes, I think it came across a lot later on after Blake's death, and especially now William Blake is known for being one of the more interesting poets because of his wacky ideas, especially about religion. Blake was super weird about religion, and so I think this idea of Blake being a glorious luminary, I think it's important because Blake, after his death, actually influenced a lot more poets and a lot more writers than he did during his time. But definitely this idea of influencing other poets and other authors and other writers stands. Blake is incredibly influential. He just wasn't during his time. And I talked about Blake's idea of religion. Now, Blake was a Christian, but one thing to point out is that he was absolutely against organised Christianity. So he's absolutely against organised Christianity. And what that means is organised Christianity was basically the church. So Blake was against the Church of England and against this idea of churches and organised religion, something known as dogma, right? Which is basically rules placed on to Christianity. So this idea that people should go into church and follow a set of rules. Blake really was against that, and he really made an enemy of the church. He really did not believe in the church ideals. So he was a Christian, but we're going to explore that a little bit later on. The type of Christian he was it's not the conventional idea of Christianity that you and me may have. He was, so against the Church of England and against the church. And when we look at London, there is that quote, isn't there? How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls. We've got that adjective blackening next to the noun church, which really highlights Blake's own opinions on the church. And this was quite a bold statement to make. Remember, back then, church was everything, and Christianity was everything. And following a certain type of Christianity, the Church of England's Christianity, was incredibly important. And the church had a huge amount of influence on the poor and on the government and on politics. The church had its own brand of political influence, and Blake didn't like that, and he didn't like the way that the church operated. He didn't like the way that Christianity was followed. I want to also add that Blake was a romantic poet. So for those of you who have looked at the Ozymandias videos, Shelley is also what we call a romantic poet. And romantic poets are essentially poets which write a lot about nature, write a lot about God, and how God is in nature. Essentially this idea that the world around us represents God. So basically, romantic poets talk about the power of nature and how nature and natural things are sublime, right? And they represent and show us God. Now, this is very different to actually when we read London the poem, we see that there's not much about nature in London. In fact, it's kind of the opposite of nature. It's about a big city, and London, remember, deals with industrialization, a lot of mention of chartered streets, the Thames, which is chartered. So again, this river, which should be very natural, is chartered. It's controlled by the government, and that's what chartered means. It means that it's controlled and monitored by the government. You've got these mentions of palace walls, you've got this idea of plagues, you've got this idea of streets mentioned over and over again, and this idea, I think, of the opposite of nature, I guess, this idea of being all crowded in one space. And we taught about the effects of industrialization, the effects of capitalism, and the way that urbanization has caused many people who lived in the countryside to gather in cities, and in this case, London. We've got mentions of prostitutes, harlots, we've got mentions of newborn infants and chimney sweeps and every man crying. So it's very different to what we know about romantic poetry, which usually deals in nature and God and the sublime and big, wide spaces. In fact, if you are familiar, you might not be, with the image of the romantic poet, it's actually an image of a man standing at a cliff's edge, looking out at this vast expanse of nature. It's this huge idea that romantic poets have been put on this earth to show people how vast and wide nature is, and as a consequence, how vast and wide God's influence is through nature. So nature is kind of used as a medium to show how amazing God is. Now, do you see why Blake is kind of a bit controversial in this sense? Because Blake is a Christian, but he is a Christian who is going against the ideals of what people knew to be Christianity. And then on top of that, London itself is kind of the opposite of this sublime movement, this idea of nature. It's pretty much everything that nature is not. It's capitalist, it's about urbanized city, it's about poverty, it's about misery. So that's very, very interesting, and I think it really represents Blake's controversial, contrasting nature. Throughout his lifetime, he never really fell into one particular role. So yes, I've written that he is a romantic poet, and I personally believe that he still is a romantic poet, just because he does believe in God and God's influence, and he does have this powerful, passionate relationship with Christianity. But he's also incredibly controversial in the way that he writes about God and nature and spirituality. Throughout his lifetime, like I said, he never really does fit into one box. He's kind of all over the place, and it's hard to pin him down as a person. But one thing that is true about Blake is his absolute disgust of the Church of England and organised Christianity and organised religion in general. So he really didn't like that. So we've clocked that the poem was written in 1794, and those of you who are aware of this time period will probably know that it was actually written during the French Revolution. And this is important because Blake himself was very interested in the French Revolution, and this links incredibly closely to London, the poem itself. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with how the French Revolution started, so first of all, I'm just going to say the French Revolution lasted for about 10 years. So it was from 1789 to 1799. And essentially what happened in the French Revolution was that there was a huge, huge difference in wealth in France, right? So the monarchy had a huge, huge amount of wealth, right? And they were so wealthy, they were literally dripping in money, and they lived in the Palace of Versailles, and they were just so rich. And the poor people in France were so very poor that they really had nothing to eat. They really had no money. This was a huge what we call difference or disparity in wealth, and this basically caused the poor people in France to rise up and storm the Palace of Versailles and actually kill the French monarchy, and actually overthrow the very idea of monarchy. And the French Revolution was huge because it definitely brought about this change in power, where before the rich were very rich and had all the power. What the French Revolution did was actually overthrow the rich people in power, overthrow the very idea of monarchy, of kings and queens having all the wealth and money. These poor people were able to combine together, and it changed the shift in power. It actually was a bit of a warning to other countries. It proved to countries everywhere that actually poor people weren't just powerless, they were able to kill even. And this revolution was all based on the idea of overthrowing the monarchy. So it was the monarchy, the people who were rich, the aristocrats, who were killed, and they were actually guillotined, they were beheaded. And yes, this revolution went on for 10 years, so it was a long, long revolution. And following the French Revolution, the power that belonged to monarchs of the time never ever remained. And it brought about a lot more democracy, a lot more dispersion of wealth. Blake was incredibly interested in this because he actually agreed with a lot of the values which started the French Revolution in the first place. Remember, London focuses especially on this idea of difference in wealth, right? He actually writes about the poor people in London not having enough money because institutions like the government, like the monarchy in England, and even the Church of England have all the wealth. So the wealth is not shared. So there's almost a sense that Blake is kind of warning the readers, and warning as a consequence all these big institutions that something like the French Revolution could very much happen in England. Okay, just like the French revolted, just like the peasants and the poor people in France revolted against the monarchy, so could the poor people in England. And there's that quote, this quote in the fourth stanza, "And the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls," which definitely, I think, resonates with the idea of the French Revolution, this idea that blood could very much run down palace walls if England is not careful, and if this wealth is not shared. What could happen could be another French Revolution, but in England. So there's this interesting idea in I'm going to call it socialism, because that's what I think it is. And if you remember, in the previous frame, I talked about capitalism and this idea of capitalism being this hierarchy, right? So there's this one man on top, and that hierarchy gets passed down to more and more workers, more and more workers. And as that kind of triangular shape goes down, more people are at the bottom working, and that wealth isn't shared. Socialism is essentially the opposite of capitalism, where wealth is shared. It's a lot more of a community feel, that everyone has similar amounts of money, and that there's not really one person at the top. There's this idea of helping other people and looking out for the poor within socialism. So it's this idea of sharing the wealth a lot more. And Blake was very interested in this, and he actually agreed with the revolution, and he agreed that actually there isn't a need for monarchy, and there isn't a need for this difference in wealth, that everyone should have a chance to share wealth and have a chance to make money, and everyone should basically be equal. Blake believed very much in individualism, right? He believed that every individual deserves money, chance in life. And so he was against the Church of England, and he was against a lot of the politics of the time, and he was very much interested in the individual person, and the individual person having access to wealth and money. And so I think that makes a lot of sense when we look at London, and we look at, you know, some of the language used in London, and the way that Blake kind of gives this image of misery because wealth is not shared. And he definitely asks the reader to empathize with the poor. We mentioned in the frame before that London is a poem which focuses a lot on urbanization. Now, I've mentioned that William Blake is a little bit controversial in his views on Christianity, but he is a romantic poet, okay? And now romanticism focuses very heavily on, yes, nature, on the poet's relationship with God, in the way that the natural world represents this real awakening in the individual. And I've discussed a little bit about how London doesn't really seem to be a typical romantic poem because it doesn't really emphasize nature, it doesn't really emphasize God. And the main theme is, of course, urbanization, this idea of capitalism and people moving and huddling together and buildings and machinery rendering so many people poor. And there's this kind of clumping of poor people together, this idea that there's no individual really. I mean, there is a subject who is wandering through the charted streets, but there's no focus on one particular person. In fact, the focus seems to be on a group of people, and there's this repetition of that
adjective, every cry of every man, every infant's cry of fear, every voice, which really seems to go against this romantic idea of one person.
And I think this is interesting, and it really emphasizes Blake's ideas and reinforces him as this romantic poet because he really, wants to focus on nature. But his argument in London seems to be that actually capitalism, urbanization, this movement that the government have installed and that the church has installed and that anyone in the higher power, like the ruling classes, have installed, which ensures that, we have this industrial revolution which has made so many poor people, so many workers move to the city and fight for positions of power and end up losing out on these positions and having to resort to poverty and robbery and chimney sweeping and whatnot. It's wrong, it's inherently unnatural, it's inherently against the very nature of man. London goes against this. It contrasts this idea, and in that sense it is a poem which is incredibly negative. It has real negative connotations about the idea of capitalism, about the idea of urbanization, about the Industrial Revolution. So I want to talk a little bit about the time period that Blake was writing in, and Blake actually had a lot of new and interesting ideas about how he believed that humans should be. And this was influenced in part by the Age of Enlightenment, which was the time period he was writing in. Now, the Age of Enlightenment was actually a movement, and it was an intellectual movement, okay? So it was very much focused on the way people thought, the way people rationalized things. So essentially what enlightenment means is a new way of thinking. So where before people were very much placed into their class, right? If you were poor, you had to stay poor. You had to be dumb because you were born into poverty. You weren't to amount to anything. You had to stay in your station. You were part of a huge amount of poor people. You weren't special. You weren't important. You didn't matter. The Age of Enlightenment, this new way of thinking, it was this idea that you as an individual, you mattered. The individual was important. So it didn't matter which class you belonged to, because you as an individual, as a human being, were as important as anyone else. So there was this huge emphasis on the individual. Instead of the class, Age of Enlightenment brought about a new rational way of thinking. And I say rational because there was this heavy influence of scientific ways of thinking. Remember, Isaac Newton was actually around in the 18th century making his discoveries on gravity, and a lot more scientists were coming about and looking at things differently. So look at this mixture between art and science that society was kind of bordering on, this idea that romantic poetry was starting, and this romantic poetry was actually a movement based off the Age of Enlightenment. Think about the way romanticism focuses on nature, that it focuses on the individual, okay? Think about the way that romantic poetry looks at, remember I said that one man standing on the corner of a cliff looking out at nature is that symbol of romantic poetry, of the power of nature. But that one man is one individual and his relationship to nature and to God. That is a huge part of romantic poetry, and it stems from this idea of enlightenment, of one human being discovering something, of realizing something, having new scientific discoveries or artistic discoveries. So the Age of Enlightenment was happening around the time that Blake was writing his poetry and doing a lot of poems, and he was heavily influenced by the Age of Enlightenment. He was heavily influenced by these ideas. And I just want to point out that actually the French Revolution a lot of people believe that that was caused by enlightenment. And that was because enlightenment was very, very focused on who you were inside as a human being. So this idea of enlightenment and the revolution are very interlinked, because people, especially poor people, started to believe that they were as important as the rich, right? That they mattered just as much as the rich, that they had a newfound power in themselves, that they were able to overthrow the rich people who were hoarding all the money, who were taking away money from them, essentially. And so this idea of enlightenment, of everyone being important, of every single individual having as much power and importance as the other, brought about this newfound focus, I think, on equality, more emphasis on the fact that everyone is basically equal. We are all made in God's image, right? And this equality began to create more, I guess you could say, problems, because a lot of societies were unequal at the time. Look at the French Revolution. It was caused by the monarchy having all the money. And so a lot of the peasants and the poor people in France decided that wasn't fair. Whereas was as deserving of money as the rich. We have to kill the rich. We have to spread out this money. They're hoarding all the wealth. So this idea of equality, this newfound belief that every individual is important, caused a lot more revolutions because of this belief that these institutions are unimportant. The government, the monarchy, the church, even, that they were very orthodox, they were very old, they were old ways of thinking. So this idea of revolution, right? And I think even now to this day, that the word revolution itself means more than just violence and revolt. It actually means a change, a new way of thinking. Blake was heavily influenced by this idea of enlightenment, of new thinking, of overthrowing old institutions, of overthrowing this old and dated idea that some people are better than others. Actually, what the Age of Enlightenment helped to do in the 18th century was create this newfound concept that the individual is capable of rational thinking, is capable of scientific thinking, that the individual mattered more than the institutions. So the poem London was actually part of an anthology of poems that William Blake wrote, which was called Songs of Innocence and Experience. So that was the title of the anthology in which London was present in. So one thing to note about this anthology is how Blake structures the poems within the anthology. So we've got Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience, and these songs are basically poems. He splits up the poems. He's got 25 poems in Songs of Innocence and 25 poems in Songs of Experience. And London, by the way, is present within the second half in Songs of Experience. So London in Experience. Now, Songs of Innocence, the first 25 poems in the anthology, are essentially happy poems. They have this running theme throughout the poems. There's 25 of them, 25 poems in Songs of Innocence in the first half, and they give the idea of this kind of childhood innocence. So they're quite idyllic poems, they're quite happy poems, there's 25 of them, and Songs of Innocence was published in 1789. So that's all Songs of Innocence. Now, Songs of Experience, which London was published in, is altogether different. These are the more sadder poems of the anthology, and in these poems you've got kind of this aged idea, right? So in the first half of the poetry anthology you've got this concept of childhood innocence. A lot of the poems are very idyllic, they're very happy, they're very innocent, so innocence. In the second half, the Songs of Experience, you've got this sadder tone, you've got this idea of being aged, of being what we like to call disillusioned. And disillusionment means when someone grows up and they realise that they're the things around them aren't as happy as they thought they were, sadder and a lot more world weary. So there's this idea of the poems in the second half are a lot more miserable, I guess, a lot more sad, a lot more aged, a lot more disillusioned. They have this running theme that everything's not okay. There's this sense in Blake's anthology of the first 25 poems being quite innocent, happy, and then in the second part of the anthology, the second 25 poems are quite miserable and quite sad, and they have this kind of sad theme to them. And of course London is part of that. And Songs of Experience was published a bit later on in 1794, right? So we've got Songs of Innocence at the beginning of the poem, and then we've got Songs of Experience, which is the second part of the poem. So we've got this idea of childhood innocence, then we've got this idea of adulthood almost. And with adulthood comes a lot more misery. With childhood comes a lot more happiness. And of course there's this idea in childhood not just of happiness. In Songs of Innocence, it's not just that the poems are clustered together to be happy, it's that they're clustered together to give this idea of innocence, in the sense that a child doesn't really know what's going on around them. They don't realize what's coming, right? And with age, you start to become more aware. Your eyes start to open to the things around you. You start to realize that things aren't okay and not everything is good. So there's this idea of growing up, this theme of aging in the anthology, this idea of growing from innocent to experienced. Now, when we link this to London, and remember London shows up in Experience, it shows up in the latter or second half of the anthology, the more sad, the more miserable part of the anthology, we get this sense, I think, that innocence becomes ruined in London, right? There's this concept of an innocent child being born and growing up and realizing that actually the world around him or her isn't so great. And you've got this kind of constant repetition of the verb cry, in every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear. And this idea of crying kind of links to childhood, I think, this idea of a child crying. You've got that mention of the infant's cry. And then this really, really interesting line in the last stanza, how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear, right? So this idea in the last stanza of a youthful harlot, right, which is such a contrasting thing in itself. The adjective youthful really gives a sense of childhood, of innocence, right? You're innocent when you're young. But then harlot, which means prostitute. So this idea that actually a prostitute should have experience, right? This idea of a prostitute having a lot of sex, having to sell her body in order to get by in society. This idea that actually the harlot who was once youthful, who was once a child, has had to grow up very quickly in order to get by in society. This contrasting idea that someone is youthful, but also someone is actually not so youthful, is actually aged in society through having to sell her body. This contrasting idea, and immediately within this phrase, this idea of growing up quickly, of learning too quickly, of realizing too quickly that not everything is good. And then her curse blasts the newborn infant's tear, right? So then you've got this idea of a newborn, and this contrast between harlot, who is probably the mother, and this newborn infant. This infant that has just been born gives it a great cyclical element. Right? And remember, cyclical is something that is circular. There's this concept, this idea of childhood being ruined, idea of childhood being kind of taken away from these poor people in society, and them having to grow up too quickly and realize and open their eyes to the misery around them. And I think the Songs of Innocence and Experience really reflects this idea of growing up quickly, of aging, awakening to the misery of the world. Blake himself wrote Songs of Innocence and Experience with this in mind, with this kind of metaphorical, symbolic idea in mind. This idea of the first half of the poem being all innocent and the second half being a lot more miserable and experienced. And he did this in response to the Industrial Revolution, because he believed, and he very passionately believed, that poverty was caused by the Industrial Revolution. He believed that a lot of poverty and a lot of misery and a lot of pain was caused by urbanization and by this new onslaught of machines and industry, causing people in the countryside to lose their jobs and have to come into London, into capital cities, in order to fight for jobs. And remember, we talk about this word revolution as a kind of new wave when people awaken and realize something and they fight for it. It's this kind of concept of new ideas. And that is essentially what I think Blake is echoing in his anthology, this idea of awakening from innocence and becoming more experienced and having new ideas. I think that's very much reflected within the anthology, but it is reflected in a very negative way. Okay, so the Industrial Revolution, to Blake, was a great cause of misery and sadness. So lastly, we are going to be talking about the form of the poem and structure. So we're not going to be talking about it for too long, I hope. Sometimes I do get a bit carried away. But I think we shouldn't be talking about it for too long, because it is, honestly guys, it is quite easy to get the idea of the form and the structure. And personally for me, when I do read London, the form and the structure doesn't cry out to me as much as the actual content of the poem cries out to me, right? As much as the language makes me get this vivid imagery in my mind, the form and structure does what it needs to do. It adds to the poem and it gives this sense of clarity. It's like, okay, well, whatever William Blake's talking about within the poem is simply just emphasized by the form of the poem and by the structure too, by the rhyme scheme too. So let's have a look. I've written that the poem has 4 lines per stanza and it has 4 stanzas. Now this is pretty simple. A lot of ordered poems have 4 lines per stanza. It's in this particular form. It's very tight. It's very packed. Right? It's very neat almost. It's orderly. And what I like to think about whenever I see 4 stanzas especially is this kind of cyclical idea. And we've talked about this word cyclical quite a lot. If you remember, cyclical essentially means cycles, right? And we've got this idea of cycles when we look at the concept of songs of innocence and experience, this idea of aging. We've got this idea of cycles when we look at the youthful harlot's curse and the newborn infant's tear. So there's this idea of children being born and growing up and becoming in this part of this cycle of poverty. You've got this idea of everyone being involved in this cycle of poverty, every man, this idea that there are so many people involved in this cycle of poverty, that new children are born and they're just simply born into poverty, right? And they grow up and they become part of poverty. So this cyclical idea, I think, is really represented by this 4 stanzas, which really represents the 4 seasons. Idea of winter coming, spring coming, summer coming, autumn coming, and then winter coming again, so on and so forth. So the idea of the 4 seasons coming and going and coming and going, this kind of cyclical idea, that's what I like to think of as cyclical. And no one really being able to escape this entrapment, this cycle, this institution of poverty. So it's quite miserable, I think, this concept of 4, 4, 4 and 4, this concept of representing a year and then 2 years and then many years, this idea of being stuck, this real cyclical concept of never being able to escape the cycle. And it's within this very ordered and tight structure, this tight 4 lines per stanza structure, which matches, I think, with this mind-forged manacles, this idea of everyone who is poor, who is trapped in this cycle of poverty, being trapped there through their own minds, right? They are stuck at the bottom because these huge governments, this huge institution of rich people, the ruling class, the aristocracy, have essentially trapped them at the bottom so that their own minds are not able to be free. The poor people in the lower class are actually oppressing themselves because they've been manipulated into being oppressed right? They've been manipulated to believe that they can never rise above. And again, we think about this concept of enlightenment. Each individual is capable of scientific thought, of rational thought. So Blake believed that enlightenment was something that everyone deserved, and he especially believed in enlightenment. But this idea of being mind forged, of being trapped by your own mind, stuck in the same cyclical rut, not being able to escape your own mind, your own ideas, your own beliefs, that you'll never amount to anything. He gives this metaphor of manacles, that people are almost shackled by their inability to be enlightened. So I think this is a direct reference to people's inability to be enlightened. So do you see how I've matched this language feature, this metaphor, right, of mind-forged manacles, to the contextual idea that Blake himself believed that a lot of the cause of poverty was due to people's lack of understanding of enlightenment, people's belief that they were stuck where they were and that they were unable to escape it, people's lack of rational thought. You know, there was this huge belief back in the late 1700s when this poem was written that if you were born into poverty, you had to stay there. You know, there was this belief that God put you where you were for a reason. So if this newborn infant is born to a harlot, to a prostitute, that newborn infant could not amount to anything. They had to stay poor. They had to probably become a chimney sweep and die of suffocation or of heat stroke, or, you know, whatever awful things chimney sweeps died of. Or, you know, they became prostitutes themselves if they were girls. So there was this idea of entrapment, which I've mentioned lots of times now. And Blake says that this is partly due to being unable to rationalize, being unable to understand that it's more than just God putting you here in this place. It's actually yourself and your mind. Mostly, these poor people believe they can't get out of their poverty and their positions because they have been told this. They are unable to escape because of the way that institutions have been set up in this hierarchy kind of structure. Look at this triangle again. This idea that there's a man at the top, right? And look how tiny the top is. You know, only a few people can access this, the ruling class. And then at the bottom, you've got this wide bottom, which belongs to the lower class. And the lower class never ever get access to this. They never get access to the top of the hierarchy because the ruling class are taking it, saturated by the ruling class. So yes, there's definitely this idea of tightness, of being oppressed, of being forged, of being kind of trapped, right? And I think it's definitely reflected in this structure, this tight structure. Look at the rhyme scheme: A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, H, G, H. Nothing interrupts this rhyme scheme. If you look at some of the other poems we've analysed, there's this real kind of connection between a rhyme scheme being interrupted and this idea of new ideas coming into play. Say we look at Ozymandias, we look at the rhyme scheme there, how it's a sonnet, but it's a different kind of sonnet. It's this reflection of Ozymandias believing he is different, for example. There's none of that here. There's a very tight rhyme scheme, this very structured and almost boring rhyme scheme within a tight form, you know, 4, 4, 4, 4. It doesn't change, nothing changes. And I definitely think this represents being trapped in your position and not being able to escape. So it's definitely, I think, within the form and structure of the poem, this element of misery, of entrapment, this inability of the lower class to ever rise above, right? This inability for enlightenment.